You can show up for people every single day and still feel invisible. You can give your time, your energy, your patience, your understanding, and somehow it still feels like none of it truly lands. On Stoicism Breath, we begin with a hard truth. That feeling is not because you lack value. It is because too much of your power has been given away in the need to be understood. Think about it for a moment. How often have you explained yourself just to feel accepted? How often have you softened your truth just to avoid discomfort? How often have you stayed available even when you were already drained? You answered messages you did not have the energy for. You laughed at things that did not sit right with you. You tried to make yourself easier to love, easier to accept, easier to understand. And slowly, without noticing, you trained the world to believe that your peace was negotiable. But real power does not work like that. Some people are remembered because they were loud. But the rare ones are remembered because their silence had weight. They did not fight for attention. They did not chase approval. They did not perform confidence like a mask. They carried themselves with something deeper: calm, control, presence. And that presence is something people only recognize after it is gone. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself that you have power over your mind, not outside events. When you truly understand that, everything changes. Strength is no longer something you try to show. It becomes something you quietly hold. Your words become more intentional. Your reactions become less frequent. Your presence becomes harder to ignore. And here is where most people get it wrong. Being unforgettable is not about acting distant or mysterious. That is not strength. That is fear trying to protect itself. Real silent power is different. It is choosing your words instead of spilling them. It is having standards without announcing them. It is giving from fullness instead of seeking from emptiness. It is becoming so aligned with who you are that people no longer feel neediness coming from you. They feel stability, and stability is rare. So let me ask you something. Are you living as yourself? Or are you performing a version of yourself that feels easier for others? Because there is a quiet exhaustion that comes from constantly trying to be acceptable. You smile when you do not want to. You explain yourself before anyone asks. You adjust your tone, your opinions, your energy just to keep things comfortable. And over time something dangerous happens. You stop knowing where your true self ends and where your fear begins. You start living inside questions. Did I say too much? Did I seem cold? Should I have responded faster? Should I have been easier to deal with? And the more you live inside those questions, the less power you have. Because your attention is no longer anchored in your character. It is scattered across other people's reactions. But a person with silent power feels different. They are not trying to win the room. They are not chasing approval. They are not reshaping themselves every time someone else changes. Their strength comes from one clear decision. I will not betray myself just to be easier for others to accept. And that decision changes everything. It does not make you cold. It makes you free. Because freedom is not doing whatever you want. It is no longer needing permission to be who you are. Epictetus once taught that if you truly want to grow, you must be willing to be misunderstood. And that is where most people stop. Because they want growth without judgment, confidence without criticism, authenticity without discomfort. But that combination does not exist. If you need everyone to approve of who you are becoming, you will never become anything new. So here is where your power begins. Not in being louder, not in being liked, but in being rooted. In choosing yourself even when it feels uncomfortable. Because the moment you stop performing for the world, is the moment the world finally begins to feel your presence. You will stay trapped inside the version of yourself that creates the least resistance. The version that is always agreeable, always easy, always available. On Stoicism Breath, we look at this honestly. That version might be liked. It might be polite. It might be easy to invite, easy to use, easy to predict. But it will never be unforgettable. Because people do not remember the person who always agreed. They remember the person who had a center. The one who could be kind without becoming weak. The one who could listen without losing their values. The one who could stand in a room full of opinions and still remain grounded in their own. That is where silent power begins. Not in what you say about yourself, but in what you consistently show. You do not need to announce discipline. Your consistency will speak. You do not need to convince others of your value. Your standards will speak. You do not need to explain your peace to people who live in chaos. Your calm will speak. The more you perform, the more replaceable you become, because performance changes depending on who is watching. But the more rooted you become, the harder you are to forget, because rooted people do not shift based on the room. So start small. Notice the unnecessary apology, the forced laugh, the automatic yes when your body is quietly saying no. Notice the long explanation you give to someone who already decided not to understand you. Pause there. That pause is where your power returns. You do not need to change your whole life overnight. You just need to stop abandoning yourself in small moments. Let your yes become honest. Let your no become calm. Let your silence become clean. Because the world does not remember the version of you that tried to please everyone. It remembers the version that finally stood still. And from here we move into the second habit, mastering your reactions before you speak. There is always a moment before every reaction, a small invisible space. And inside that space your real power is decided. Someone says something disrespectful. A message arrives with a tone you do not like. Someone interrupts, misunderstands, or underestimates you. And before you respond, before your face changes, before your fingers start typing, two versions of you appear. One wants to react immediately, to defend, to prove, to feel powerful. The other wants to pause, to stay still, to remain free. Most people lose themselves right there. They feel emotion rise, and they follow it. They feel the need to defend, and they call it honesty. They feel urgency to reply, and they call it strength. But what feels like strength in the moment often becomes regret later. The sharp response, the emotional message, the unnecessary argument, the tone that shows someone they can control you. This is where silent power begins to separate you. You stop letting your first emotion become your final decision. Epictetus said something simple but powerful. People are not disturbed by events. They are disturbed by the meaning they give those events. It is not just the words someone says. It is the story your mind creates. They disrespected me. I need to respond. I need to prove myself. And once that story takes over, your reaction is no longer a choice. It becomes automatic. But a person with silent power lives differently. They do not deny emotion. They simply refuse to be controlled by it. Anger can appear without being followed. Irritation can rise without becoming words. Hurt can exist without turning into a performance. This is not weakness. This is control. Real control. Because mastering your reaction does not mean accepting disrespect. It means you do not let that disrespect define who you become. You can respond firmly without becoming chaotic. You can set boundaries without becoming harsh. You can walk away without needing the last word. And that is where true strength lives. Not in reacting faster, but in choosing better. Not in proving yourself, but in protecting your character. The real shift begins when you stop speaking from injury and start speaking from command. On Stoicism Breath, this is where silent power becomes real. A reaction that comes from injury is trying to win. It is trying to prove something. It is trying to protect a wounded part of you. But a response that comes from command is different. It is not trying to win the moment. It is trying to stay aligned with who you are. That is why silence can be more powerful than words. Silence gives you space. Space to return to yourself. Space for the first wave of emotion to pass. Space to decide whether this moment actually deserves your voice. Think about how often people speak too quickly. Not because they are clear, but because they are afraid. Afraid that silence will make them look weak. Afraid that if they do not respond immediately, they will lose control. But silence is not weakness. It only looks weak to people who mistake noise for power. A grounded person protects the space between feeling and action. And in that space, they ask better questions. Is this worth my peace? Is this worth my dignity? Am I responding from my values or from my wounded pride? Will speaking now make me clearer or just louder? These are not soft questions. They are precise tools of self-control. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He knew he would face difficult people every day. Arrogance, selfishness, ignorance. But he also knew something more important. Other people's chaos does not have to become your chaos. That is the core of silent power. You do not enter every storm that invites you. You do not respond to every tone with your full energy. You do not allow someone else's lack of control to take control of you. And something interesting happens when you live this way. Your words begin to carry weight, because you are no longer speaking all the time. You are not constantly explaining, defending, or reacting. So when you do speak, people listen, not because you are louder, but because you are rare, not because you attack, but because you are clear. So before you speak, pause, not forever, not out of fear, just long enough to return to yourself. Let the first emotion move through your body without becoming your voice. Let your values stand between what happened and how you respond. And if you choose to speak, speak clean, speak with precision, without begging, without attacking, without letting your emotions spill into the moment. Because the person who controls their reaction controls the doorway to their peace. And when people realize they cannot easily disturb that space, they begin to feel your presence differently. Now there is another level of silent power that most people avoid. Carrying your flaws without shame. There is a quiet strength in someone who no longer panics when their imperfections are seen. They do not pretend to be perfect. They do not rush to hide every mistake. They do not rewrite their past to sound more acceptable. They simply stand in the truth of who they are, and because of that, they become very difficult to control. Most people are not trapped by their flaws. They are trapped by the fear of being exposed. They spend their lives hiding, performing, trying to look flawless. And that is where the real prison begins, not in the mistake itself, but in the constant effort to hide it. Stoicism does not ask you to hate your flaws. It asks you to stop being ruled by them. A flaw becomes heavy when you turn it into your identity. I failed becomes I am a failure. I made a mistake becomes I am not enough. And once you believe that, you move through life like you are always about to be discovered, always about to be judged. But silent power changes that completely. You learn to see yourself clearly, without drama, without exaggeration. You admit what is real. You correct what you can. You accept what belongs to the past. And you refuse to let your imperfections take your dignity, because there is nothing powerful about pretending. But there is something deeply powerful about honesty without fear. When someone owns their flaws, they feel different. They are not trying so hard to appear perfect, so others feel more relaxed around them. They are not performing superiority, so others feel less pressure to perform. Their calm creates space for truth, and that is a rare kind of presence. A presence that does not come from perfection, but from alignment. There is a kind of acceptance that feels powerful but is actually fragile. On Stoicism Breath, we look at this clearly. When your sense of self is built on an image, you have to constantly protect it. You have to maintain it, act it out, defend it. And all it takes is one reminder of who you used to be, one criticism, one honest moment, and that image begins to shake. That is not strength. That is emotional debt. Real strength looks different. Marcus Aurelius did not write to himself as a perfect man. He wrote as someone correcting his own mind. And that is what made his thinking so powerful, because Stoicism is not about never falling. It is about refusing to turn the fall into your identity. A flaw only becomes dangerous when you refuse to see it. When it stays hidden, it starts making decisions for you. Your insecurity chooses who you chase. Your fear chooses what you tolerate. Your shame chooses what you hide. And slowly, without realizing it, you are no longer in control. But the moment you bring that flaw into awareness, something changes. You weaken its power. You can say, "This is part of me, but it does not control me." That is where freedom begins. You do not worship your flaws. You refine them. You do not hide them. You understand them. You do not turn your past into a place of punishment. You turn it into a place of learning. So the next time shame appears, pause, look at it directly. Ask yourself, is this asking me to hide, or asking me to grow? Is this memory here to punish me, or to teach me? Am I protecting my dignity, or protecting an image? And then choose clearly. Face what is true. Improve what can be improved. Release what cannot be changed. And move forward, without asking your past for permission. Because the person who can carry their flaws without shame becomes very difficult to control. They cannot be easily exposed. They cannot be reduced to one mistake. because they have already faced themselves honestly. And once you do that, the world has less power over you. Now there is another place where people quietly lose their power. In relationships. In the need to be chosen. It does not always look obvious. Sometimes it looks like being kind for too long. Being available even when you are exhausted. Accepting half effort and calling it patience. You tell yourself you are understanding. But deep down you know. You are no longer choosing from strength. You are waiting from fear. And this is where your power begins to leak. Because when you need to be chosen, your life becomes a series of silent questions. Do they still like me? Did I do enough? Should I give more? Should I lower my standards? Should I ignore what I feel? And every one of those questions places your worth in someone else's hands. You stop asking, is this good for me? And start asking, am I good enough for them? Stoicism brings you back to something harder but cleaner. Not everything you want is good for you. Not everyone you feel attached to is aligned with you. Not every connection deserves continued access to your life. A grounded person does not measure others by desire. They measure them by impact. Do they make you more honest, more disciplined, more peaceful, more courageous? Or do they pull you into anxiety, confusion, performance, and self-abandonment? That one question can change your life. Because many people are not attached to reality. They are attached to potential, to the idea of who someone could become. If they finally changed, if they finally understood, if they finally cared. But what you are holding on to is not the person. It is the story. It is the possibility. It is the hope of being chosen. And that hope can become addictive. You wait for the message. You wait for the effort. You wait for consistency. And while you wait, something dangerous happens. Your body starts confusing anxiety with connection. You feel intensity and call it love. You feel inconsistency and call it mystery. You feel neglect and call it patience. But a connection that keeps you in emotional hunger is not depth. It is dependency. And silent power begins the moment you stop needing to be chosen and start choosing for yourself. There is a moment where everything shifts. On Stoicism Breath, we see it clearly. The silently powerful person stops asking, do they want me? And starts asking, do I choose this? That one question changes everything, because it brings your center back to you. You are no longer waiting in a quiet room, hoping someone else decides your worth. You remember something simple. Your life is not a waiting room. It is a place where you choose. When you begin choosing people instead of needing them, relationships stop being proof and start becoming reflections. Reflections of your values, your standards, your direction. You no longer keep someone close just because losing them hurts. Because pain is not always a signal to hold on. Sometimes pain is the cost of returning to yourself. Think about that. How many times have you stayed? Not because it was right, but because leaving felt uncomfortable. That is not connection. That is attachment without awareness. And attachment without awareness becomes a quiet form of control. This is why Epictetus taught something very precise. Freedom begins when your desire lives only where your power exists. If your peace depends on someone else's mood, their attention, their affection, their approval, then your peace is not yours. It is borrowed. And anything borrowed can be taken back. That is not love. That is captivity. A person with silent power loves differently. They love deeply, but not desperately. They care, but they do not collapse. They stay loyal, but never betray themselves just to prove it. Because real connection is not built on emotional hunger. It is built on mutual freedom. Marcus Aurelius understood this. He reminded himself to accept people as they are, not as he wished they would become. But here is the part most people avoid. Acceptance does not always mean closeness. Sometimes acceptance means you stop trying to rewrite someone. You stop editing them into the version you needed. You let them be exactly who they are. And then you choose. So stop asking people to prove your worth. Stop auditioning for connection. Stop begging for emotional presence. Stop lowering your standards just to avoid the silence that follows. Yes, that silence can feel uncomfortable at first, but it is clean. And clean silence is always better than noisy confusion. Because in that silence, you begin to remember yourself. You remember that your attention is valuable. Your loyalty is valuable. Your emotional depth is valuable. Your consistency is valuable. But when those things are given to the wrong people, they stop being gifts and start becoming burdens. So you begin to choose more carefully, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You stop collecting people just to avoid being alone. And instead, you build a life where only the right people come close. People who do not disturb your peace, but respect it. And when that happens, your presence changes. You become unforgettable, not because you chased anyone, but because you stood firmly in your own life. Now there is another level to this. The fifth habit, holding your standards without explaining them. There is a kind of strength that does not speak loudly. It does not argue. It does not justify. It does not perform. It simply lives by one quiet rule. If it costs my self-respect, it is too expensive. And once you truly believe that, everything about you shifts. You stop trying to convince people to treat you well. You stop turning every boundary into a speech. You observe, you decide, and you move. That is silent power. Because standards are not proven by what you say. They are proven by what you accept. Anyone can say I know my worth. But the real test comes in a quiet moment, when someone you care about gives you less than you deserve, and your fear whispers, just accept it, so you do not lose them. That is where your standards become real. That is where your character is decided. Most people do not lack standards. They lack the willingness to enforce them. They know when something feels wrong. They feel it in their body, in the tension, in the exhaustion, in the quiet discomfort after a conversation. But they ignore it, because they are afraid of what enforcing a boundary might cost, and that fear keeps them stuck. But here is the truth. Every time you ignore your standard, you teach people how to treat you. And every time you honor it, you teach yourself who you are. So instead of explaining your value, start living it. Let your actions speak. Let your boundaries be quiet. Let your decisions be clear. Because the moment you stop negotiating your self-respect, is the moment your presence begins to carry real weight. There is a quiet pattern most people never question. On Stoicism Breath, we bring it into the light. You already know when something is wrong. You feel it when someone is using your kindness, when your time is not respected, when your energy is taken without care. But instead of acting from that awareness, you start explaining. You explain why you are hurt. You explain why it matters. You explain it again and again, hoping that one day, if you say it perfectly enough, they will finally understand. But here is the truth most people avoid. When someone is committed to misunderstanding you, more explanation is not communication. It is self-abandonment, just with better words. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you tried to explain your value to someone who already showed you they did not value it? At some point, it is no longer about clarity. It is about control. Trying to control how someone sees you, instead of choosing how you respond to them. This is where the Stoic path becomes clear. You return to what is yours, your choices, your limits, your response, your access. Because real power is not convincing someone to care. It is recognizing when they do not, and acting accordingly. You do not need to explain your standards to people who benefit from you having none. You do not need to justify your need for respect. You do not need to defend your right to peace. Sometimes strength sounds very simple. This does not work for me. I am not available for that. I will not continue this conversation in this tone. No. And sometimes, the strongest boundary is never spoken. It is shown. Through distance. Through consistency. Through the quiet decision to stop participating. That is where your power returns. Because kindness without standards becomes an invitation. An invitation for careless people to test how much of yourself you are willing to lose. A silently powerful person understands something deeper. Love needs structure. Friendship needs structure. Loyalty needs structure. Generosity needs structure. Not because you are cold, but because you are protecting something valuable. Your inner stability, your self-respect, your peace. Standards are not walls built to keep everyone out. They are gates built to choose who enters. A wall says no one can come in. A gate says not everyone belongs here. That is the difference. Silent power is not isolation. It is selection. It is understanding that your life becomes the shape of what you repeatedly allow. So instead of explaining your standards, live them, calmly, firmly, without turning every limit into a speech, without apologizing for needing peace, without asking permission to be respected. Because when your life becomes clear, people no longer need long explanations. They understand where they stand, by how they show up. And the person who explains every boundary is still asking for approval, but the person who lives by them has already decided, and nothing is more powerful than someone who has decided that their peace is no longer available at a discount. Now there is a deeper layer to this. The sixth habit, staying deep without losing control. You read one short message, and suddenly your mind creates 10 meanings. You notice a small shift in tone, and your thoughts start building an entire story. It feels like awareness, but often, it is not depth. It is depth without discipline, and depth without discipline can trap you, because the same sensitivity that makes you perceptive can also make you reactive. A deep person sees what others miss. They notice subtle changes, unspoken tension, hidden emotion. They listen beneath the words. They care about meaning, about loyalty, about sincerity, but without control, that depth can turn against them. What makes you caring can turn into attachment. What makes you perceptive can turn into suspicion. What makes you thoughtful can turn into overthinking. So the goal is not to feel less. The goal is to guide what you feel. Real power begins when your depth is directed. When you can feel deeply, without drowning, care deeply, without clinging, love deeply, without losing yourself. That is the balance. That is the discipline. That is where sensitivity becomes strength, not a weakness. Because when your emotions no longer control your actions, your awareness becomes an advantage, and your presence becomes something people cannot easily disturb. There is a quiet pattern most people never question. On Stoicism Breath, we bring it into the light. You already know when something is wrong. You feel it when someone is using your kindness, when your time is not respected, when your energy is taken without care. But instead of acting from that awareness, you start explaining. You explain why you are hurt. You explain why it matters. You explain it again and again, hoping that one day, if you say it perfectly enough, they will finally understand. But here is the truth most people avoid. When someone is committed to misunderstanding you, more explanation is not communication. It is self-abandonment, just with better words. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you tried to explain your value to someone who already showed you they did not value it? At some point, it is no longer about clarity. It is about control. Trying to control how someone sees you, instead of choosing how you respond to them. This is where the Stoic path becomes clear. You return to what is yours, your choices, your limits, your response, your access. Because real power is not convincing someone to care. It is recognizing when they do not, and acting accordingly. You do not need to explain your standards to people who benefit from you having none. You do not need to justify your need for respect. You do not need to defend your right to peace. Sometimes strength sounds very simple. This does not work for me. I am not available for that. I will not continue this conversation in this tone. No. And sometimes, the strongest boundary is never spoken. It is shown. Through distance. Through consistency. Through the quiet decision to stop participating. That is where your power returns. Because kindness without standards becomes an invitation. An invitation for careless people to test how much of yourself you are willing to lose. A silently powerful person understands something deeper. Love needs structure. Friendship needs structure. Loyalty needs structure. Generosity needs structure. Not because you are cold, but because you are protecting something valuable. Your inner stability, your self-respect, your peace. Standards are not walls built to keep everyone out. They are gates built to choose who enters. A wall says no one can come in. A gate says not everyone belongs here. That is the difference. Silent power is not isolation. It is selection. It is understanding that your life becomes the shape of what you repeatedly allow. So instead of explaining your standards, live them, calmly, firmly, without turning every limit into a speech, without apologizing for needing peace, without asking permission to be respected. Because when your life becomes clear, people no longer need long explanations. They understand where they stand, by how they show up. And the person who explains every boundary is still asking for approval. But the person who lives by them has already decided, and nothing is more powerful than someone who has decided that their peace is no longer available at a discount. Now there is a deeper layer to this. The sixth habit, staying deep without losing control. You read one short message, and suddenly your mind creates 10 meanings. You notice a small shift in tone, and your thoughts start building an entire story. It feels like awareness, but often, it is not depth. It is depth without discipline, and depth without discipline can trap you, because the same sensitivity that makes you perceptive can also make you reactive. A deep person sees what others miss. They notice subtle changes, unspoken tension, hidden emotion. They listen beneath the words. They care about meaning, about loyalty, about sincerity. But without control, that depth can turn against them. What makes you caring can turn into attachment. What makes you perceptive can turn into suspicion. What makes you thoughtful can turn into overthinking. So the goal is not to feel less. The goal is to guide what you feel. Real power begins when your depth is directed. When you can feel deeply, without drowning, care deeply, without clinging, love deeply, without losing yourself. That is the balance. That is the discipline. That is where sensitivity becomes strength, not a weakness. Because when your emotions no longer control your actions, your awareness becomes an advantage, and your presence becomes something people cannot easily disturb. There is a subtle difference most people never learn to see. On Stoicism Breath we slow it down and make it visible. You can notice everything, without becoming trapped by it. You can feel deeply, without being pulled in every direction. That is the balance. Because Stoicism does not ask you to feel less. It asks you to stop being controlled by every feeling that rises inside you. Think about how most people respond. If they feel hurt, they react immediately. If they feel anxious, they search for reassurance. If they feel angry, they speak without pause. It feels honest. It feels real. But not everything that is real is wise. A feeling can be true and still not deserve control over your actions. Just because something rises inside you does not mean it should lead you. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He reminded himself that the mind has the ability to step back and observe its own thoughts. That means when a feeling appears, you do not have to become it. You can look at it. You can question it. You can ask, where did this come from? And where is it trying to take me? That space between feeling and action, that is maturity. Maybe you have been told your whole life that you are too much, too sensitive, too intense, too emotional, too thoughtful. And maybe over time, you started shrinking yourself just to make others comfortable. But the answer is not to become shallow. The answer is to become disciplined. Think of it like a river. A river without boundaries becomes a flood. But a river with structure becomes direction, becomes strength, becomes life. Your depth needs boundaries. Your emotions need structure. Your sensitivity needs wisdom. Your passion needs purpose. Because without structure, your inner world spills everywhere. You exhaust yourself, not because you feel too much, but because you have not yet learned how to hold what you feel. And holding is different from hiding. Hiding says, I cannot show this. It makes me weak. Holding says, I can feel this, without letting it control me. One comes from fear, the other comes from strength. This is where Epictetus gives you a powerful tool. Examine your impressions. Something happens, and your mind immediately creates a story. They ignored me. They do not respect me. I am losing them. But pause. Ask a better question. Is this a fact, or is this a judgment? The message was not answered. That is a fact. They do not care about me. That is a judgment. Someone spoke with a different tone. That is a fact. They are pulling away. That is a judgment. When you learn to separate these, everything changes. You stop letting old wounds write new conclusions. You stop reacting to the past while thinking you are responding to the present. Real emotional maturity begins here. Not when you stop feeling, but when you stop believing every feeling immediately. So the next time something intense rises, Do not rush. Give it space. Breathe. Name it. This is anger. This is fear. This is attachment. This is wounded pride. Naming creates distance, and distance creates choice. Then ask yourself, what would the disciplined version of me do right now? Let your emotions inform you, not control you. Let your depth become quiet strength, not noise. Because the world does not need you to feel less. It needs you to be more grounded in what you feel. And when a deep person gains control, something powerful happens. They bring warmth, without neediness, presence, without pressure, truth, without noise, love, without losing themselves. And that is what makes them unforgettable. Now there is one final layer to understand. The seventh habit, giving from fullness, not from emotional hunger. There is a kind of giving that looks beautiful on the outside, but quietly hurts on the inside. You give your time, your attention, your support, your patience. You show up for everyone. You listen, you carry, you stay, and you call it love. But sometimes, it is not love. It is fear. Fear that if you stop giving, they will leave. Fear that if you stop being useful, you will be forgotten. Fear that if you stop holding everything together, no one will choose you. That is not generosity. That is survival, disguised as kindness. A silently powerful person learns the difference. They do not stop caring. They do not become cold. But they stop giving to earn safety. They stop giving to be needed. They stop confusing exhaustion with loyalty. Because when you give from emptiness, every act of kindness secretly asks for something back. Recognition, reassurance, proof. And when that does not come, resentment begins to grow, quietly, in the place where love was supposed to live. So instead, you learn to give differently. You give because you are full, not because you are afraid. You give because it aligns with you, not because you are trying to hold someone close. And when you reach that point, your presence changes again. It becomes lighter, stronger, and far more real. Because now, you are no longer giving to be chosen. You are giving because you already chose yourself. There is a quiet truth that changes everything. On Stoicism Breath, we bring it back to something simple. Your peace cannot depend on what you do not control. Other people's appreciation, their emotional maturity, their ability to give back what you give. None of that is yours to control. So if your giving depends on receiving the perfect response, your inner world will always feel unstable. This is where Epictetus becomes very clear. Freedom begins the moment you stop placing your happiness in things outside your control. That does not mean you stop caring. It means your care must come from a place that is already grounded. You can support someone sincerely, but you cannot build your identity on being needed. You can be generous, but not to the point where your own energy runs empty. Think about that. How often have you given so much that you had nothing left for yourself? That is not strength. That is imbalance. A full person gives differently. They give because it reflects who they are, not because they are trying to earn affection. They help because it aligns with their values, not because they are afraid of being forgotten. They show up because it is right, not because they need proof that they matter. And here is the shift. When their giving is not appreciated, they do not collapse. They learn. They adjust. They become wiser. Because their stability was never placed in the reaction. It was placed in the intention. When you are full within yourself, your presence feels different. People feel warmth, but not pressure. They feel connection, but not obligation. They feel loyalty, but not desperation. They know you are there because you choose to be, not because you are afraid of being without them. Marcus Aurelius pointed to something powerful. Look within, because within is the source. A fountain does not chase people to be filled. It flows because it already has something inside. That is what makes someone unforgettable. Not chasing, not clinging, not giving until they disappear, but becoming a source. So before you give, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, am I giving freely? Or am I hoping this will make me more valuable? Am I helping because it is right? Or because I am afraid to disappoint? Am I offering support from strength, or from a wound? These questions change everything. Because the goal is not to give less. The goal is to give better, more consciously, more honestly, more sustainably. You do not need to become cold. You need to become whole. A whole person can care deeply and still remain steady. They can love fully and still remain free. They can give generously and still know when enough is enough. So instead of pouring yourself out, start filling yourself first, not with ego, not with pride, but with discipline, with self-respect, with purpose, with silence, with reflection, with meaningful work, with honest relationships, with a steady connection to yourself. Build a life you do not need to escape from. Build enough calm inside you that when you live, your presence feels like a gift, not a recognition. You stop waiting for people to say, and you start giving because you are already full. And from that place, something changes. Your presence becomes unforgettable, not because you made people feel, but because you feel it. But it feels like you received from someone who never had to lose themselves to give. And when you bring all of this together, you begin to understand what silent power really is. It is not comfort. It is not distance. It is not pretending you do not care. It is quiet strength. It is discipline. It is choosing not to leak your energy into every situation, every opinion, every reaction, every unstable connection. It is the decision to stop performing for approval, the patience to master your reactions before you speak, the courage to carry your flaws without shame, the wisdom to choose people instead of needing them. And when you live this way, you are no longer moved by everything around you. You become the one who decides. And that is where real power begins.